Jake Sullivan wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the smoking engine of his cargo ship. The old vessel had finally given up after 3 months of deep space hauling between the outer colonies. Black smoke poured from the main drive unit while warning lights flashed red across every control panel. "Captain?" Lisa Morrison climbed down from the pilot's seat and shook her head. The woman had been flying ships for 20 years, but even she looked worried about their current situation. They had dropped out of hyperspace near Astoria Prime when the engine started making horrible grinding noises. The planet below them was home to the Zephyrian Empire, one of the most advanced civilizations in this sector of the galaxy. Their cities looked like they were made of crystal and light. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful or so intimidating. Lisa activated the emergency beacon and requested permission to land at the main spaceport. The response came back in perfect English, which surprised Jake. Most alien species required translation devices to communicate with humans. The spaceport was massive and gleaming white. Ships from dozens of different worlds sat in organized rows. Jake noticed that their beat-up cargo hauler looked very out of place among all the sleek vessels. Zephyrian workers moved around with fluid grace, their tall blue forms seeming to glide rather than walk. Jake grabbed his toolkit and headed for the engine bay. He figured he could at least try to fix the problem while Lisa handled the paperwork with Port Authority. The damage looked worse than he had hoped. They would need new parts and probably several days of work. A group of Zephyrian guards approached their ship. Jake assumed they were just doing routine security checks. The aliens wore elaborate armor that seemed to be made from the same crystal material as their buildings. Their faces were hard to read, but they moved with obvious purpose. The lead guard stopped in front of Jake and spoke in accented but clear English. The guard said they had been waiting for Professor Sullivan to arrive. Jake looked around, confused, because he did not see any professor nearby. The guard continued speaking about educational protocols and advanced teaching methods. Jake realized the guard was talking to him. He tried to explain that there had been some mistake. He was just a mechanic trying to fix his broken engine, but the guard seemed to interpret his words differently. When Jake mentioned training new workers and teaching them to solve problems, the guard nodded approvingly. The conversation became more strange when the guard asked about Jake's methods for handling difficult students. Jake thought about the apprentices he had trained over the years. Some of them had been pretty stubborn. He explained how he usually started with simple tasks and let them figure things out for themselves. The guard seemed very impressed by this answer. Jake tried again to clarify that he was not a professor, but every time he mentioned his work experience, the guards became more convinced that he was exactly who they were looking for. Another guard arrived and spoke rapidly in the Zephyrian language. Jake caught a few words that sounded like urgent and royal summons. The first guard turned back to Jake and explained that Princess Lirelei was waiting to meet her new tutor. Jake felt his stomach drop. These aliens thought he was some kind of teacher for their princess. He started to protest more strongly, but the guards were already motioning for him to follow them. They seemed to think his reluctance was just academic modesty. Lisa noticed the commotion and walked over to see what was happening. The guards explained that they were escorting the famous Professor Sullivan to the palace. Lisa looked at Jake with complete confusion. She knew he had never been to college, and certainly was not any kind of professor. Jake tried to signal to Lisa that something was very wrong, but the guards were being so polite and respectful that it felt rude to keep arguing with them. They kept praising his innovative approach to education and expressing how honored they were to meet him. The guards loaded Jake into an elegant transport vehicle that hovered several feet off the ground. As they flew toward the Crystal Palace, Jake could see the entire capital city spread out below them. The architecture was unlike anything from human space. Everything seemed to grow naturally from the ground like enormous flowers made of gemstone. During the flight, the guards continued asking Jake about his teaching philosophy. Desperate to maintain the conversation, Jake talked about his experiences training mechanics. He mentioned how important it was to let people make mistakes and learn from them. He explained that the best way to understand something was to take it apart and put it back together. The guards exchanged meaningful looks and made notes on their data tablets. Jake began to realize that his simple ideas about learning were being interpreted as profound educational theory. The more he tried to downplay his expertise, the more impressed they became with his humility. The palace was even more magnificent up close. Towers of colored crystal rose hundreds of feet into the air. Gardens filled with impossible plants surrounded courtyards where fountains played music instead of just making water sounds. Jake had never imagined that such beauty could exist. Inside the palace, everything was smooth curves and soft lighting. Jake felt very out of place in his work clothes and heavy boots. The guards led him through corridors lined with artwork that seemed to move and change as he watched. They finally arrived at an enormous chamber where Queen Seraphina waited on a throne that appeared to be carved from a single massive diamond. The queen was tall and elegant, like all Zephyrians, but she carried herself with obvious authority. Her skin had a faint blue tint and her eyes were larger than human eyes. Queen Seraphina spoke in a voice that somehow managed to be both musical and commanding. She thanked Jake for coming such a long distance to help with her daughter's education. She explained that Princess Lirelei had struggled with traditional teaching methods and needed someone with fresh ideas. Jake opened his mouth to explain the misunderstanding, but the queen continued talking. She described how previous tutors had failed to engage the princess. The royal family had heard wonderful things about Professor Sullivan's revolutionary methods. They were willing to pay any price for someone who could help their daughter reach her potential. The weight of the situation finally hit Jake. These people were depending on him to teach their princess. They had made arrangements and preparations based on expecting a real professor. If he admitted the truth now, he might cause some kind of diplomatic incident. Queen Seraphina asked Jake if he was ready to meet Princess Lirelei. Jake nodded slowly, knowing he was getting himself into serious trouble, but unable to see any other option. The queen smiled and called for her daughter to join them. Princess Lirelei entered the chamber, and Jake understood immediately why the royal family was concerned. The young Zephyrian looked bored and frustrated. Her posture suggested someone who had given up on learning long ago. She went through the motions of formal greetings, but her heart clearly was not in the process. The princess looked Jake up and down with obvious skepticism. She had probably met many tutors before and expected this one to disappoint her, just like all the others. Jake realized he had one chance to make a good impression, or this whole charade would fall apart immediately. Queen Seraphina left them alone in a beautiful study filled with floating books and holographic displays. Princess Lirelei sat down at an ornate desk and pulled out what looked like a mathematics text. She opened to a page covered with equations that made Jake's head spin. Just looking at them, the princess announced that she wanted to test his knowledge before they began formal lessons. She pointed to an equation that seemed to involve multiple dimensions and asked Jake to solve it. The numbers and symbols meant absolutely nothing to him. Jake stared at the problem and felt panic rising in his chest. Then he remembered something from his work repairing gravity generators. The basic principle was about balancing forces. He looked at the equation again and saw it differently. Instead of trying to solve it mathematically, Jake started talking about how engines worked. He explained that when different forces pushed against each other, you had to find the point where they balanced out. He used his hands to demonstrate the concept of equilibrium. Princess Lirelei stopped looking bored. She asked Jake to explain more about these forces. Jake talked about pressure and resistance and how mechanical systems found their own balance points. He drew simple diagrams showing how energy flowed through different pathways. The princess began nodding as Jake's explanation continued. She said that no one had ever described the mathematical concepts in such practical terms before. The equations suddenly made sense to her when she could picture them as real physical processes. Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. He had somehow managed to help the princess understand the problem, but he also realized that this success would make it even harder to escape from his fake identity. The princess was looking at him with genuine interest for the first time, as their first lesson ended. Princess Lirelei told Jake that she was looking forward to tomorrow's session. Jake nodded and smiled, while internally wondering how long he could keep this deception going. He was just a mechanic who happened to be good at explaining things in simple terms. Walking back to his quarters, Jake knew he was in way over his head, but something about the princess's excitement made. Jake woke up in the most comfortable bed he had ever experienced. The guest quarters in the Zephyrian Palace made his tiny cabin on the cargo ship feel like a storage closet. Soft light filtered through walls that seemed to be made of translucent crystal. He could hear musical sounds drifting in from the gardens outside. Despite the luxury, Jake felt sick with worry about what he had gotten himself into. Today he would have to continue pretending to be a professor while teaching Princess Lirelei. He had no idea what subjects a royal heir was supposed to learn. A palace servant brought breakfast on a floating tray. The food looked beautiful, but Jake could barely identify most of it. He managed to eat something that tasted like fruit, and drank a beverage that reminded him of coffee. The servant explained that Princess Lirelei would meet him in the study after the morning court session. Jake spent the time exploring the palace and trying to understand Zephyrian technology. Everything seemed to work by mental commands or gentle touches. Doors opened when he approached them. Lights adjusted themselves to perfect levels automatically. He had never seen such advanced systems. In the library, Jake found books that translated themselves as he read. Most of the subjects were far beyond his understanding. Advanced physics, interstellar law, diplomatic protocol, and economic theory filled thousands of volumes. He began to appreciate how much a real princess needed to learn. Dr. Kalen appeared while Jake was looking through the books. The Zephyrian academic was tall and thin with intense eyes that seemed to see everything. He introduced himself as the palace's chief educational advisor. His tone was polite, but Jake sensed suspicion underneath. Dr. Kalen asked about Jake's background and training. Jake tried to give vague answers about working with young people and helping them solve problems. The academic took notes and asked follow-up questions that made Jake increasingly nervous. When Princess Lirelei arrived, she looked more interested than she had the day before. She told Dr. Kalen that yesterday's lesson had been the first time she truly understood those mathematical concepts. Dr. Kalen raised an eyebrow and made more notes in his tablet. After Dr. Kalen left, Princess Lirelei showed Jake the lesson plan that previous tutors had used. The schedule was packed with theoretical subjects like quantum mechanics, advanced calculus, and molecular biology. Jake felt overwhelmed just reading the list. Princess Lirelei explained that she had always struggled with these abstract concepts. The traditional teaching methods involved memorizing formulas and reciting facts. She said it felt like trying to understand a machine by only looking at pictures of it. Jake realized this was exactly the problem. The princess learned the same way he did, by getting hands-on experience. He suggested they start by finding something that was actually broken and needed fixing. Princess Lirelei looked confused, but agreed to try his approach. They found a malfunctioning environmental control unit in one of the palace corridors. The device was supposed to regulate temperature and humidity, but it kept cycling between too hot and too cold. Jake opened the access panel and showed Princess Lirelei the internal components. As they examined the system together, Jake explained how the sensors detected environmental conditions and sent signals to the processing unit. He showed her how to trace the flow of information through different pathways. When they found a damaged connection, Princess Lirelei helped him repair it. The princess was amazed when the system started working properly. She said she had never realized that the physics equations she studied actually described real processes. happening all around her. Jake felt proud that his simple approach had helped her understand something important. Word about their unconventional lesson spread through the palace. Some of the staff were scandalized that the princess was doing manual work, but others noticed how excited she seemed about learning for the first time in years. Captain Lisa Morrison was having her own adventures, trying to find Jake. The spaceport authorities kept telling her that Professor Sullivan was busy with important royal duties. When she insisted that Jake was just a mechanic, they assumed she was testing their security procedures. Lisa finally convinced a sympathetic dock worker to help her investigate. The worker explained that the real Professor Sullivan had been delayed by cosmic storms. The guards had mistaken Jake for the missing academic and taken him to the palace. Lisa realized she needed to get word to Jake about what had happened. Meanwhile, Jake was discovering that his teaching methods worked for more than just technical subjects. When Princess Lirelei struggled with diplomatic theory, Jake set up role-playing exercises. He had her practice negotiating with the kitchen staff for better meals, or convincing the gardeners to let her help with their work. These practical exercises taught the princess about reading body language, finding common ground, and building trust. She learned more about real diplomacy in a few days than she had from months of studying theoretical protocols. Dr. Kalin grew more suspicious as he observed these unusual teaching methods. He began asking other palace staff about Professor Sullivan's credentials. The academic also started researching Jake's supposed background and found several inconsistencies in the official records. Jake tried to stay ahead of Dr. Kellen's investigation by keeping his lessons focused on practical skills. When the princess needed to learn about economics, they visited the palace workshops and talked to craftspeople about supply and demand. When she studied biology, they examined plants in the gardens and discussed how living systems adapted to their environment. Each lesson built on concepts from previous sessions. Princess Lirelei began to see connections between different subjects that she had never noticed before. Mathematics helped her understand engineering. Biology gave her insights into social systems. Physics explained how everything from engines to emotions followed similar patterns. The princess started applying these lessons to real problems around the palace. When a dispute arose between different groups of workers, she used negotiation techniques Jake had taught her. When the kitchen staff complained about inefficient workflows, she suggested improvements based on systems thinking. Queen Serafina noticed the changes in her daughter immediately. Princess Lirelei seemed more confident and engaged with everything around her. The queen was impressed by Professor Sullivan's methods, even though they were completely different from traditional Zephyrian education. Jake began to feel more comfortable in his role as teacher. He discovered that many of his experiences as a mechanic translated well to other subjects. Problem-solving, systematic thinking, and learning from mistakes were useful skills, no matter what someone was studying. But his situation became more complicated when palace security reported that someone at the spaceport was asking questions about Professor Sullivan. Jake worried that his deception was about to be discovered. He needed to find a way to contact Lisa and figure out their next move. Dr. Kalin scheduled a formal evaluation session to assess the princess's progress. Jake knew this would be his biggest test yet. If he could not demonstrate that Princess Lirelei was truly learning, Dr. Kalin would certainly expose him as a fraud. The evaluation took place in front of several palace officials. Dr. Kalin presented Princess Lirelei with complex problems that combined multiple subjects. Jake watched nervously as she worked through each challenge using the practical approaches he had taught her. Princess Lirelei impressed everyone by explaining her solutions in clear, simple terms. She showed how mathematical concepts related to real-world situations. She demonstrated diplomatic skills by mediating a mock dispute between the evaluators. She applied scientific principles to solve a puzzle about resource allocation. Dr. Kalin looked troubled by the results. The princess had clearly learned more in a few weeks than she had in months of traditional instruction, but her methods were so different from standard academic approaches that he could not understand how the learning had occurred. After the evaluation, Queen Seraphina privately thanked Jake for his remarkable work with her daughter. She said the royal family was grateful to have found such an innovative educator. Jake felt guilty about accepting praise for what was essentially just treating the princess like a normal person who wanted to understand how things worked. That evening, Jake received a coded message through the palace communication system. Lisa had managed to contact him and warned that the real Professor Sullivan would arrive within a few days. She also mentioned that Dr. Kalin had been asking questions about Jake's identity. Jake realized his time was running out. He needed to prepare Princess Lirelei for the transition to a new tutor, while figuring out how to escape before his deception was revealed. But looking at how much the princess had grown in just a short time, he felt reluctant to abandon her progress. The princess had started to trust him and was finally enjoying the learning process. Jake wondered if there was a way to maintain her momentum without continuing the charade that had become increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. As he fell asleep in his comfortable palace bed, Jake knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He had to balance his desire to help Princess Lirelei with the growing risk of discovery. The simple mechanic was about to face the most complicated problem he had ever encountered. Princess Lirelei burst into the study with more energy than Jake had ever seen from her. She carried a data tablet filled with notes and diagrams that she had created on her own. The change in her enthusiasm was remarkable compared to the bored young woman he had first met. She explained that she had spent the morning applying his problem-solving methods to a trade dispute that had been troubling the Royal Council for months. Two neighboring star systems were arguing about shipping routes, and neither side would compromise. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed completely. Jake listened as the princess described how she had reframed the problem. Instead of focusing on who was right or wrong, she looked for underlying needs that both sides shared. She discovered that each system was worried about economic security and wanted reliable access to trade partners. The princess had proposed creating a joint shipping cooperative where both systems would benefit from shared resources and expanded markets. Her solution addressed everyone's concerns, while creating new opportunities that neither side had considered before. Queen Seraphina had been so impressed that she asked Princess Lirelei to present the proposal to the full council that afternoon. Jake felt proud of his student but also terrified about the attention this success would bring to his teaching methods. Prince Darien arrived at the study while they were discussing the presentation. The princess's older brother was a military officer who usually showed little interest in academic matters. But he had heard about the trade dispute solution and wanted to meet the tutor responsible for his sister's transformation. Prince Darien was more direct than his sister in testing Jake's knowledge. He described a logistics problem that had been hampering their defense forces. Supply convoys were taking too long to reach remote outposts, and the complex routing system was inefficient. Jake asked Prince Darien to draw a map showing the current supply routes. As they examined the diagram together, Jake saw immediately that the Zephyrians were overthinking the problem. They had created an elaborate system that looked impressive but wasted time and resources, using principles. From his cargo hauling experience, Jake suggested consolidating shipments and establishing intermediate supply depots. He showed how breaking long routes into shorter segments would actually improve speed and reliability. The solution was so simple that Prince Darien seemed almost embarrassed not to have thought of it himself. The prince left to test Jake's suggestions with his logistics staff. Jake hoped the ideas would work, but worried about drawing more attention from the royal family. He was already struggling to maintain his false identity under normal circumstances. Dr. Kalin appeared shortly after Prince Darien departed. The academic had been investigating Jake's background more thoroughly and found several troubling inconsistencies. He wanted to discuss Professor Sullivan's published research and academic credentials. Jake tried to deflect these questions by focusing on practical results rather than theoretical background. He pointed out that Princess Lirelei was learning faster than ever before and applying her knowledge to real problems. Dr. Kalen admitted this was true, but remained troubled by Jake's unconventional approach. The conversation was interrupted when a palisade announced that Ambassador Chen had arrived for a diplomatic function. Jake's blood ran cold when he heard the name. Chen was the human ambassador to this sector and would certainly recognize that. Jake was not Professor Sullivan. Dr. Kalen offered to introduce Jake to the ambassador during the evening reception. Jake made excuses about needing to prepare lessons and promised to meet Ambassador Chen later. He knew he had to find a way to avoid the diplomat completely. Princess Lirelei noticed Jake's distress and asked what was troubling him. Jake explained that he was feeling overwhelmed by all the attention his teaching methods were receiving. The princess assured him that everyone was just excited to see her making progress. The afternoon council session where Princess Lirelei presented her trade proposal was a complete success. The older council members were amazed by her practical approach to the complex dispute. They approved her solution immediately and praised her. Innovative thinking. Jake watched from the back of the chamber as the princess confidently explained her reasoning. She had learned to break down complicated problems into manageable pieces and look for creative solutions that benefited everyone involved. Her natural intelligence had finally found proper direction. Prince Darian returned that evening with news that Jake's logistics suggestions had solved their supply problems. The military staff was redesigning their entire distribution system based on the simple principles Jake had shared. The prince wanted to discuss more ideas about strategic planning and resource management. Jake found himself trapped between growing success and increasing danger. The royal family was thrilled with his results, but Dr. Kalen was becoming more suspicious. Ambassador Chen was somewhere in the palace asking questions that could expose everything. During the evening reception, Jake managed to avoid Ambassador Chen by staying near the kitchens and service areas. He learned that the ambassador was asking palace staff about their experiences with the new human tutor. Jake knew it was only a matter of time before Chen tracked him down. Princess Lirelei found Jake hiding in a storage room and demanded to know what was happening. She had noticed his strange behavior and was worried that something was wrong. Jake wanted to tell her the truth, but could not find the courage to admit his deception. Instead, Jake talked about feeling homesick and missing his simple life among the stars. Princess Lirelei seemed to understand this emotion. She shared her own feelings about the pressure of royal responsibilities and the loneliness of always being watched and judged. Their conversation helped Jake realize that despite their different backgrounds, he and the princess faced similar challenges. Both of them were trying to live up to expectations while staying true to themselves. Both of them sometimes felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The princess asked Jake to tell her about human culture and how people lived on Earth. Jake described his childhood in the mining colonies, where everyone worked together to survive in harsh environments. He talked about the importance of practical skills and helping your neighbors when problems arose. Princess Lirelei was fascinated by the idea of communities, where people's worth was measured by their contributions rather than their birth status. She wondered if some of these human values could be applied to improve Zephyrian society. Jake suggested that the best way to understand different cultures was through direct experience, rather than just reading about them. This gave him an idea for tomorrow's lesson that might help the princess while keeping him away from Ambassador Chen. The next morning, Jake proposed that they visit different areas of the palace to learn from the people who actually kept the complex running. Princess Lirelei had never spent time with maintenance workers, kitchen staff, or security personnel. Jake thought she could learn valuable lessons from their practical expertise. Their first stop was the engineering section, where Zephyrian technicians maintained the palace's advanced systems. Jake was amazed by their technology, but noticed that The workers followed rigid procedures without questioning whether better methods might exist. Princess Lirale asked the engineers about their biggest challenges. They described recurring problems with power distribution and environmental controls. Jake suggested approaching these issues systematically by examining one component at a time, instead of trying to solve everything at once. The engineers were initially skeptical of advice from outsiders, but when Jake demonstrated troubleshooting techniques that he used on Starship systems, they began to see possibilities they had never considered. The princess watched eagerly as human and Zephyr knowledge combined to solve problems more effectively. In the kitchens, they learned about resource management and workflow optimization. Jake showed how rearranging preparation areas could reduce wasted motion and improve efficiency. Princess Lirale practiced leadership skills by organizing cooking teams and coordinating complex meal preparations. The kitchen staff were amazed that their princess wanted to understand their work. They taught her about planning, timing, and working under pressure. Princess Lirale discovered that managing a kitchen involved many of the same skills needed for governing a kingdom. Security personnel showed them surveillance systems and threats assessment procedures. Jake was impressed by their dedication but noticed they relied heavily on technology instead of human intuition. He shared some techniques for reading body language and detecting suspicious behavior that he had learned from dealing with difficult cargo clients. Each location they visited taught Princess Lirale something new about leadership, problem-solving, and understanding different perspectives. She began to see the palace as a complex system where every person played an important role. Dr. Kalen followed their progress and grew more concerned about these unorthodox teaching methods. He reported to Queen Seraphina that Professor Sullivan was exposing the princess to inappropriate activities. Traditional royal education did not involve manual labor or socializing with service personnel. Queen Seraphina decided to observe one of Jake's lessons personally. She arrived at the engineering section while Jake was helping Princess Lirale understand power grid management. The queen watched as her daughter confidently discussed technical concepts with the maintenance crew. Princess Lirale presented a solution to a recurring power fluctuation problem that had puzzled the engineers for weeks. Her approach combined theoretical knowledge with practical understanding of how the systems actually operated. The engineers immediately began implementing her suggestions. Queen Seraphina was impressed, despite her initial concerns. She could see that her daughter was developing real leadership skills and practical knowledge. The princess was learning to work with people from all levels of society, instead of just giving orders from above. Jake felt relieved that the queen approved of their methods, but his anxiety increased when he noticed Ambassador Chen talking to Dr. Kalen near the entrance to the engineering section. The two officials seemed to be having an intense conversation while looking in Jake's direction. Princess Lirale suggested they visit the communications center next. Jake agreed enthusiastically because it would take them to a different part of the palace away from Ambassador Chen. But he knew he was running out of places to hide. The communications staff showed them how the palace maintained contact with other worlds and coordinated interstellar activities. Princess Lirale learned about information networks, data analysis, and crisis communication protocols. Jake realized that these skills would be crucial for any future leader. The princess needed to understand how information flowed through complex systems and how to make decisions based on incomplete data. These were exactly the kinds of practicabilities that traditional academic education often missed. As they walked back to the study, Princess Lirale thanked Jake for showing her a completely different way of learning. She said that for the first time in her life, education felt exciting instead of boring. She was discovering abilities she never knew she possessed. Jake felt both proud and guilty about the princess's progress. He genuinely cared about her success, but knew that his deception was becoming more dangerous every day. Soon he would have to choose between protecting himself and continuing to help the young woman, who had become his most rewarding student. Jake woke up to urgent knocking on his door. A palisade informed him that the real Professor Sullivan had arrived during the night and was demanding to know why someone else was using his identity. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized his time had finally run out. Dr. Kalin had arranged a formal demonstration where both tutors would present their teaching methods to the royal court. The academic wanted to expose Jake publicly and show everyone that traditional education was superior to his unconventional approach. Jake dressed quickly and tried to think of an escape plan, but palace security was already waiting outside his quarters to escort him to the demonstration chamber. Captain Lisa Morrison was there too, looking worried, but determined to support him through whatever was about to happen. Lisa whispered that she had tried to warn him earlier, but Dr. Kalin had intercepted her messages. She also mentioned that the real Professor Sullivan seemed arrogant and difficult to work with. The academic had spent the morning complaining about primitive facilities and demanding special accommodations. The demonstration chamber was filled with palace officials, royal family members, and distinguished visitors. Jake saw Ambassador Chen sitting in the front row looking very confused about the situation. Queen Serafina presided over the proceedings with obvious concern about the potential scandal. Professor Sullivan was a thin, nervous man who wore elaborate academic robes and carried himself with obvious self-importance. He had multiple degrees from prestigious universities and had written several books about advanced educational theory. His credentials were impressive, but his personality was unpleasant. Dr. Kalin introduced both tutors and explained that they would demonstrate their methods using Princess Lorelei as a test subject. The real professor would go first, followed by the imposter who had been deceiving the royal family. Professor Sullivan began with a lecture about quantum mechanics that was filled with complex mathematical formulas and abstract concepts. He spoke in a monotone voice while displaying holographic equations that covered the entire wall. Princess Lorelei looked bored and confused within minutes. When Professor Sullivan asked the princess to solve a theoretical problem, she struggled to even understand what he was asking. The academic grew impatient and criticized her lack of preparation. He suggested that previous tutors had obviously failed to give her proper foundations in advanced mathematics. Jake watched the princess's confidence disappear as Professor Sullivan continued his harsh criticism. The young woman who had been excited about learning just days before was retreating back into the frustrated shell where Jake had first found her. Dr. Kalin called for Jake to present his methods next. Jake stood up slowly, knowing that anything he said would probably expose him as a fraud. But seeing Princess Lorelei's distress made him angry enough to take the risk. Instead of trying to copy Professor Sullivan's academic approach, Jake asked the princess to describe the palace's power grid system. She immediately brightened and began explaining how energy flowed through different circuits and what happened when various components failed. Jake guided her through increasingly complex questions about electrical engineering, systems management, and resource allocation. Princess Lorelei answered confidently, using concepts she had learned during their practical lessons around the palace. The audience watched in amazement as the princess demonstrated deep understanding of technical subjects through real-world examples. She solved theoretical problems by relating them to actual systems she had worked with. Her explanations were clear and logical, instead of memorized formulas. Professor Sullivan grew angry as he realized that his student understood concepts he had failed to teach. He accused Jake of teaching inappropriate subjects that had nothing to do with proper royal education. He demanded to know Jake's academic credentials and professional background. Dr. Kalin stood up and announced that Jake was actually a cargo ship mechanic named Jake Sullivan who had been pretending to be Professor Sullivan. The revelation caused shocked murmurs throughout the chamber. Queen Serafina looked betrayed and furious. Jake accepted the accusation without trying to defend himself. He apologized to the royal family for his deception and explained how the misunderstanding had occurred. He admitted that he had no formal education and was not qualified to teach anyone. Princess Lirelei jumped to her feet and angrily confronted Dr. Kalin and Professor Sullivan. She declared that Jake had taught her more in a few weeks than all her previous tutors combined. She demanded to know why formal credentials mattered more than actual results. The princess challenged Professor Sullivan to solve the same practical problems that Jake had helped her master. When the academic failed to explain how his theoretical knowledge applied to real situations, she accused him of being useless, despite his impressive degrees. Prince Darien entered the chamber at that moment with news that changed everything. The logistics improvements Jake had suggested had prevented a major supply crisis that could have left several outposts defenseless. The military reforms based on human thinking had saved lives and resources. The prince supported his sister's defense of Jake and criticized the academic establishment for ignoring practical results. He pointed out that Jake's simple approach had solved problems that highly educated experts had been unable to handle. Queen Serafina called for order as the demonstration devolved into heated arguments. Ambassador Chen requested permission to speak and explained that Jake's methods represented typical human educational philosophy. He said that Earth's rapid technological advancement came from this practical approach to learning. Dr. Kalin accused Jake of being a spy who had infiltrated the palace to steal Zephyrian secrets. He demanded Jake's immediate arrest and suggested that the deception might be part of a larger human plot against the Empire. Captain Morrison stood up and angrily denied these accusations. She explained that Jake was just a mechanic whose ship had broken down. She vouched for his character and challenged anyone to prove that he had acted with malicious intent. Palace security moved to arrest Jake. Despite the protests from Princess Lirelei and Prince Darien, Jake did not resist as they placed restraints on his wrists. He felt relief that the deception was finally over, even though he faced serious consequences. Princess Lirelei declared that she would renounce her claim to the throne if Jake was harmed. She argued that punishing someone for achieving better results than trained professionals would send a terrible message about Zephyrian values. Queen Serafina found herself facing an impossible choice. Her daughter was threatening to abandon her royal duties unless the palace protected someone who had admittedly deceived them all. But Jake's methods had produced undeniable improvements in the princess's education. The queen ordered a recess while she considered the situation. Jake was taken to a secure holding area while the royal family debated his fate. Captain Morrison was allowed to visit him and promised to contact Earth authorities if necessary. Dr. Kalin spent the recess gathering evidence to support his spy accusations. He compiled a list of palace systems that Jake had examined during his teaching sessions. The academic argued that this information could be valuable to potential enemies. Professor Sullivan demanded that he be allowed to resume the princess's education immediately. He claimed that Jake's influence had corrupted her thinking and that she needed proper academic instruction to undo the damage. Princess Lirelei refused to work with Professor Sullivan and barricaded herself in her chambers. She sent messages to Jake promising that she would not let the palace punish him for helping her succeed. Prince Darien supported his sister and began organizing other officials who had benefited from Jake's advice. Captain Morrison contacted Earth's diplomatic corps to report Jake's situation. She also reached out to other human traitors who could testify about Jake's character and background. The captain was determined to prove that her friend was innocent of any wrongdoing. Jake sat in his cell, thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had gone from being a simple mechanic to someone who had influenced an entire royal family. The experience had taught him that he possessed abilities he had never recognized. Despite facing possible execution for his deception, Jake felt proud of what Princess Lirelei had accomplished. She had discovered her potential and learned to think independently, no matter what happened to him. She would continue applying the practical problem-solving skills he had taught her. The holding area, where Jake waited, was comfortable but clearly designed to contain dangerous prisoners. Guards checked on him regularly, but refused to discuss what decisions were being made about his future. Jake tried to stay calm while preparing for the worst possible outcome. As night fell over the Crystal Palace, Jake could hear distant sounds of argument and activity. The royal family was clearly struggling to resolve the crisis his presence had created. He wondered if Princess Lirelei was still fighting for his freedom, or if she had been convinced to accept traditional tutoring. Captain Morrison brought him food and updates about the ongoing debates. She reported that public opinion was divided between those who supported Jake's practical methods and those who felt betrayed by his deception. The situation had become a test of Zephyrian values and priorities. Jake realized that his fate would determine whether the Empire valued innovation over tradition. If they punished him harshly, it would send a message that results mattered less than proper credentials. If they showed mercy, it might encourage others to challenge established methods. The mechanic who had accidentally become a teacher prepared to face whatever judgment awaited him. His greatest hope was that Princess Lirelei would continue learning and growing regardless of what happened to her unconventional tutor. Jake spent a sleepless night in the palace detention area wondering what would happen when morning came. The comfortable cell felt like a tomb as he waited for Queen Seraphina to decide his fate. Captain Morrison had been banned from further visits after arguing too loudly with the guards. Princess Lirelei had apparently spent the night planning something dramatic. When dawn broke over the crystal towers, she appeared in the throne room with a formal challenge that shocked everyone. She demanded a public teaching demonstration between Professor Sullivan and Jake, with herself as the test. Subject, the princess announced that she would accept the results of this contest as final judgment on Jake's methods. If Professor Sullivan could teach her more effectively, she would submit to traditional education and drop her support for Jake. But if Jake proved superior, she wanted his immediate release and recognition. Queen Seraphina was reluctant to allow such an unusual proceeding. But Princess Lirelei threatened to create a scandal by publicly denouncing Zephyrian education if her challenge was refused. The royal family could not afford political instability over a tutor controversy. Dr. Kalin supported the demonstration because he was confident Professor Sullivan would vindicate traditional academic methods. The chief advisor believed that proper theoretical education would easily triumph over Jake's crude practical approach. Jake was brought from detention to face this final test. He looked exhausted and worried, but Princess Lirelei smiled encouragingly when she saw him. She had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment and seemed confident about her strategy. The demonstration began with Professor Sullivan presenting an advanced physics problem that involved multiple theoretical concepts. He explained the mathematical foundations using complex equations and abstract principles. His presentation was technically accurate, but completely incomprehensible to anyone without extensive academic background. Princess Lirelei listened politely, but asked Professor Sullivan to explain how his theoretical solution would work in practice. When the academic could not provide concrete examples, she pointed out that his teaching method failed to connect abstract knowledge with real applications. Professor Sullivan became defensive and accused the princess of lacking proper respect for academic authority. He suggested that her previous tutor had filled her head with inappropriate ideas about questioning established knowledge. His condescending attitude angered many observers who had been supporting traditional education. Jake's turn began with the same physics problem, but he approached it completely differently. Instead of starting with mathematical theory, he asked Princess Lirelei to describe a practical situation where these concepts might apply. She suggested the palace's gravity generation system. Working together, they examined how the theoretical principles actually functioned in the gravity generators. Jake helped the princess understand each concept by relating it to observable mechanical processes. She learned the mathematics by seeing how numbers described real physical relationships. Princess Lirelei solved the original problem by applying her new understanding to the practical system she could visualize. Her explanation was clear and logical, demonstrating genuine comprehension rather than memorized formulas. The audience could follow her reasoning even without advanced education. The contrast between the two teaching methods was obvious to everyone watching. Professor Sullivan had failed to communicate effectively, despite his impressive credentials. Jake had helped the princess learn complex concepts using simple explanations and practical examples. Engineer Pete Davis arrived during the demonstration as part of Captain Morrison's plan to support Jake. Pete was Jake's colleague from their cargo hauling days and could testify about human educational philosophy and Jake's character. Pete explained to the court that Jake's teaching methods were completely normal among humans. Earth's educational system emphasized hands-on learning, practical problem-solving, and learning from mistakes. This approach had enabled humanity's rapid technological advancement, despite being relatively new to interstellar civilization. Dr. Kalin argued that Jake's success was just luck, and that proper education required systematic theoretical foundations. Pete challenged this view by demonstrating how human engineering had solved problems that stumped more advanced civilizations. He pointed out that practical knowledge often led to theoretical breakthroughs, rather than the reverse. Ambassador Chen finally spoke up to support Pete's explanation of human culture. The diplomat confirmed that Jake's methods represented standard human approaches to education and problem-solving. He vouched for Jake's integrity and dismissed suggestions that the mechanic was engaged in espionage. Queen Serafina found herself facing a choice between tradition and innovation. The demonstration had clearly shown that Jake's methods produced better learning outcomes than conventional academic instruction. But accepting this conclusion would challenge fundamental assumptions about Zephyrian education. Princess Lyra made an emotional appeal to her mother and the assembled court. She described how Jake's teaching had transformed her relationship with learning and given her confidence in her own abilities. She begged them not to punish someone who had helped her discover her potential. Prince Darian supported his sister by presenting evidence of Jake's positive impact on palace operations. The logistics improvements, engineering solutions, and diplomatic innovations had all resulted from applying human-style thinking to Zephyrian problems. The practical benefits were undeniable. Professor Sullivan made a final attempt to discredit Jake by questioning his lack of formal credentials. The academic argued that education was too important to be left to untrained individuals regardless of their apparent success. He demanded that proper academic standards be maintained. Jake finally spoke in his own defense for the first time since his arrest. Instead of making excuses for his deception, he used the opportunity to give one final lesson about the value of learning from mistakes and having the courage to try new approaches. Jake admitted that he had made serious errors in judgment by continuing his false identity, but he argued that those mistakes had led to valuable discoveries about alternative teaching methods. He suggested that the willingness to experiment and learn from failure was more important than avoiding all risks. The mechanic's honest acknowledgement of his faults while standing by his achievements impressed many observers. Jake demonstrated the same principles he had taught Princess Lyra about taking responsibility for mistakes while continuing to work toward improvement. Queen Serafina announced her decision after conferring privately with her advisors. She declared that while Jake's deception was inexcusable, his results could not be ignored. The Queen offered him an official position as educational consultant if he would agree to work within proper diplomatic channels. Jake politely declined the offer and explained that he belonged with his ship and crew among the stars. But he suggested establishing an exchange program where Zephyrian students could learn about human educational methods and humans could study advanced alien technologies. Princess Lyra was granted permission to visit Earth as part of this cultural exchange. She would spend several months learning about human society and educational systems, while sharing Zephyrian knowledge with Earth's universities. The arrangement satisfied her curiosity. While maintaining proper diplomatic protocols, Dr. Kalon was reassigned to research human educational methods and develop ways to incorporate practical learning into traditional Zephyrian curricula. His expertise in academic theory would be valuable for creating hybrid approaches that combine the best of both systems. Professor Sullivan was offered a consulting position, but chose to return to his university rather than work with unconventional methods. His departure was handled diplomatically, but few people regretted losing his services. The palace staff had been unimpressed by his arrogant attitude. Captain Morrison was relieved when Jake was finally released and cleared of all charges. She had spent days worrying about her friend and crewmate while dealing with diplomatic complications. The experienced pilot was eager to return to their simple cargo hauling business. The repairs to their ship were completed with Zephyrian assistance as an apology for the confusion. Jake's vessel received several technological upgrades that would make future journeys safer and more efficient. The royal family wanted to part on friendly terms, despite the unusual circumstances. Jake's final conversation with Princess Lirelei was emotional for both of them. She thanked him for teaching her to think independently and solve problems creatively. He encouraged her to continue questioning established methods and finding better ways to help her people. The princess gave Jake a crystal communication device that would allow them to stay in contact across interstellar distances. She promised to update him about her progress and asked for advice when she encountered difficult challenges. Jake was honored to have such a remarkable student and friend. As their ship lifted off from Astoria Prime, Jake reflected on the strangest few weeks of his life. He had accidentally discovered abilities he never knew he possessed while helping a young woman realize her own potential. The experience had changed both of their lives in unexpected ways. Captain Morrison teased Jake about his brief career as a royal tutor, but admitted she was proud of what he had accomplished. She suggested that he might consider teaching when they eventually retired from cargo hauling. Jake laughed and said one accidental teaching job was enough for any lifetime. 6 months later, Jake received a message from Princess Lirelei describing her successful mediation of a complex trade dispute using negotiation techniques he had taught her. She had also convinced the Royal Council to implement educational reforms based on human methods throughout the Zephyrian school system. Jake smiled as he read about his former students' achievements while training a new apprentice mechanic on his ship. He used the same hands-on methods that had accidentally revolutionized an alien civilization, proving that sometimes the best teachers are those who do not even know they are teaching. The simple mechanic had learned that education was really about helping people discover their own capabilities, rather than filling their heads with information. Whether teaching a princess or training an apprentice, the principles remained the same. Everyone learned best when they could see how knowledge applied to real problems they cared about solving. Jake continued his career hauling cargo between distant worlds, but he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a real difference in someone's life. Princess Lirelei would become a better leader because of their time together, and the Zephyrian Empire would benefit from her innovative thinking for generations to come.